was part of the faction that took over in 1982. So he definitely saw his faction rise to power and then fail.
Then under Gorbachev, it seemed at that time very exciting. It looked as though there was a real reform. 1 week to the next week, you never quite knew what was happening. His attempts at changing a communist authoritarian system into a sort of social democracy, which is roughly what his idea was, it just wasn't practical. Once you start pulling the system apart, the whole thing collapses.
The demographic issue is definitely terminal. Their birth rate collapsed back in the 1980s and has never recovered. So if they pull this off, they will probably not die out until the 2070s to 2080s. If they fail, we're looking at a disintegration of the Russian system within 20 years.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. And this time we're discussing a momentous event in history, which 32 years ago ended the Cold War. It is, of course, the collapse of the Soviet Union, described by President Putin as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. We'll discuss that, among other things, in a moment with geopolitical analyst and author Peter Zeihan and former Moscow correspondent and long-standing leader writer for the Times, Michael Binyon. Welcome to both of you. Thank you for joining us on Frontline. Michael, if we could start with you. You were the diplomatic editor at the Times when the Soviet Union collapsed, and you observed it here from the UK. Can you just walk us through the context? I mean, you also reported on the fall and were there when the Berlin Wall fell. Could you just put it all in context for us, if you will?
Well, it was really a gradual process with Gorbachev losing control little by little. It started off when of course, the thing that got it going was the coup, where he was overthrown for a brief 3 days. That, in turn, had been sparked by his attempt to give more individual freedom to the various Soviet republics, which caused a lot of upset and agitation. It was especially the Baltic republics, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, that had been pushing hard for a further distance from Moscow. And he was overthrown, exiled or kept under house arrest in his villa on the Black Sea. He returned much weakened politically, where Yeltsin had made all the running. Yeltsin had actually faced down the coup plotters, and Yeltsin was then the big power in the land. And then it was quite clear that a lot of the republics were very unhappy about the present situation, Yeltsin particularly, and Russia was agitating for its own separate status, virtually independence. Yeltsin was confirmed as the president pushing for independence of Russia, and then one by one, all the other ones decided they too needed to push for their own independence, particularly Ukraine, of course. The Baltics had already decided to go their own way. And Gorbachev essentially just lost power just like that. And then there was a motion in the Supreme Soviet for the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And without any further ado, it just collapsed, as it were, overnight. And it fell apart into the constituent republics.
And Peter, how do you remember the collapse of the Soviet Union? Where were you and how did you react?
Well, I definitely wasn't in Moscow. I was in high school. What I've learned in the Times, first of all, let me say I agree entirely with that assessment. That is exactly how things went. But from my point of view, taking the long view of history, the real break happened roughly 8 years before, when we had another coup, when the KGB took over the Politburo and we had Andropov come to power. One of the fun things about a totalitarian system is if you're not in the intelligence networks, you don't really have a good view of what's going on within your own country. And so Andropov's clique realized that the end was coming anyway. He realized that no one loved the Soviet Union. He realized the economic inconsistencies of it were tearing it apart, and that the game had to change. And so he purged the rest of the Politburo of all the other factions and took over. And that is Andropov, who then died, and Chernomyrdin, who then died, and Gorbachev, who, to be perfectly blunt, was the third stringer. And Gorbachev was unsuccessful at launching any meaningful reforms that might have saved things. So I agree with the assessment that 1989 is when it all went down, when it all finally broke, but it was probably 1982, 1983 when the deal was actually sealed. And the challenge we have today is when we look across the world, in Russia and in China, Where else are we having that 1982 moment? We're seeing it in Moscow. We're seeing it in Beijing. And things are about to get delightfully interesting.
Um, Michael, when I spoke to you last time, you said you were surprised by the collapse of the Soviet Union. You didn't necessarily think it was going to go that far.
Well, I didn't think it would go that far when I was in Moscow, and that was in Brezhnev's time, before the Andropov takeover. We then had this extraordinary period of old, basically ill, incapable leaders trying to lead a country that was clearly failing economically and failing in almost every other way. The Brezhnev time when I was there was a time of what they called stagnation. I mean, absolutely nothing much was happening politically. Plenty happening around the world, of course, Afghanistan, the Moscow Olympics, all sorts of events. But in terms of the country developing and the economy developing, it was just standing still, not going anywhere. And that's why I didn't think that the system itself would collapse. I just thought either a strongman would come in and it would shake it all up, or I just saw it just sort of limping on forever and ever. But then under Gorbachev, it seemed at that time very exciting. It looked as though there was a real reform. 1 week to the next week, you never quite knew what was happening. There was a lot of enthusiasm, but living standards were dreadful. There was nothing in the shops. The economy was seizing up. Nobody was satisfied. There was plenty to talk about, but not enough to eat. And in the end, that was what overcame. I mean, that's what finished off Gorbachev. I mean, his attempts at changing a communist authoritarian system into a sort of social democracy, which is roughly what his idea was, it just wasn't practical. Once you start pulling the system apart, the whole thing collapses.
And Peter, I mentioned in the introduction that President Putin views this, the collapse of the Soviet Union, as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. How do you think this has influenced him and made him the kind of leader he is today?
Putin was part of the faction that took over in 1982. So he definitely saw his faction rise to power and then fail. Something to keep in mind about Putin that most people don't realize is he's of the Gorbachev cloth of being a bit of a pro-Westerner and trying to be a reformer. And if you remember back to right when he took over, and especially right after the 9/11 assaults, he basically offered to the United States control of Central Asia in exchange for a partnership that would allow Russia to reform itself. Now, that may have never been feasible. The US may have never been interested. The Russians may have never been interested in bending the way that they would have needed to. But there was a very real effort in his early years to change the system from the ground up. And when that did not work, he fell back not on Soviet instincts, but pre-Soviet Russian czarist instincts, and that's led to the world that we're in now.
And Michael, do you agree with that? Is
I
that
do agree. Yes, completely, absolutely. And in fact, one of the great causes of his resentment is the fact that he did offer the Americans help. He offered them a lot of help over Afghanistan at the time, but he felt they were just dismissive, that they didn't reward Russia. They didn't accept that Russia was still a great power in any way, and he felt his country had been slighted and insulted. And that led to his general feeling that the West would never really accept Russia as a partner.
Do you think the West is partly responsible for creating a monster?
Well, I wouldn't say responsible, but the West certainly, it was too cavalier in sort of then dismissing Russia as, frankly, a country that we don't need to bother about too much anymore. Of course, the nuclear thing was still extremely important. I mean, the fact that Russia was still formidably armed with nuclear weapons then and is now. I mean, that, of course, is a main consideration. But it was all a question of status and face and the feeling that the Russians somehow had just lost their position in the world. And it's a sort of end of empire feeling, the feeling, who are we now?
Peter, Putin was stationed in KGB offices in the Dresden when the Berlin Wall came down. He experienced that powerlessness when he was told by Moscow not to meet the protesters outside with force. Do you think that marked him? Do you think that influenced his career path?
I think it certainly did, realizing that all of the tools of the state were not available. But I think a more searing example was his job. His job was to find ways to steal technology from the former West Germany. And, no offense to the Germans. I'm not saying that they're laggards, but when your job is to steal crumbs in order to make your country maybe a little bit more functional, that has got to shape your professional outlook on what your country is capable of.
And how did it shape him, do you think?
The inferiority complex that the Russians have has always been immense. They've always had a superiority complex based on an inferiority complex. And for Putin personally, his entire career was sublimated within that inferiority complex.
And Michael, that inferiority complex, do you think that that was really triggered then? We talked about this kind of heyday when he first became president, and that he seemed quite open towards the West and offered help. How might the West have actually acted differently if it missed opportunities to build on that potential for closer relations?
Well, it's hard to know. I agree very much with Peter. There's a mixture of inferiority complex. I mean, Russians never trust anything their own country or government does. They always think it's not going to work, and usually it doesn't, or it's shoddy, or it's second rate, or they can't do it, or somehow they just aren't smart enough or skilled enough to match up to the West. But when the West points that out, they get very angry and outraged. They sort of feel you're degrading or slighting us. So it's very difficult for the West to know how to respond to that. I mean, if you sort of say, well, here we offer you the hand of friendship and we'll offer you all kind of help in reforming your sclerotic economy or help in trying to overcome a system that is no longer functioning, they sort of resent, interference from outside. They feel, well, we are a big power. We don't need you to tell us what to do. So unlike Eastern Europe, where they welcomed with open arms the help that the West did give them in trying to bring them out of communism into a more functioning system, I think Russia would have found that very difficult to accept, being a big country that it is, with its own sense of history and destiny. So I'm not quite sure how they could have really assuaged Russian pride, but they certainly didn't make much effort to pay any kind of real attention to the Russians after the fall of communism. And the feeling is that they would simply come along with the West and go along with Western ideas. There was a proposal even to invite Russia to join NATO, which it never got very far.
Now,
yes, it does seem incredible, but the Russians...
a very different NATO.
Yes.
Well, that was why they didn't ask him in the end. They felt that the Russians would certainly swamp it and overwhelm it. And of course, the eastern members of NATO would never have accepted that. But yeah, I don't really see how the West should or could have done something much more constructive. But the Russians felt that they'd been neglected.
Peter, if we can just turn... Sorry, do you want to say something?
Yeah, so for the Russians to feel secure, for them to get out of the post-Cold War environment, what they feel they would have needed, not just out of respect, but out of security, you would have had to condemn roughly 120 million people living between NATO and Russia to live according to security norms dictated by Moscow. So even if there was a way we could have lied a little bit better or massaged the ego a little bit more, it was never in the cards to sacrifice Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Slovakia, the Czech Republic, Romania, Bulgaria, not to mention, Ukraine, Georgia, the Caucasus. What the Russians wanted was all of the security deference they got during the Cold War, but without the military and economic capacity to maintain that themselves. And that was never going to happen.
Michael, if we could turn the clocks back to the Gorbachev era, before the collapse, and that point when the relations with the US had warmed. He sought to build bridges with the US, with France, with West Germany and the UK, and was invited to Washington. There was this kind of famous moment when he went on that spontaneous walkabout. What do you think people back home were thinking about that at the time? How did the Soviet Union view that?
Well, I think the intellectuals viewed it with great excitement because it led to an intellectual opening. It led to an end of taboos on all sorts of things. I mean, you could start asking questions about Russian history. You could start talking about Stalin in a way that didn't, get you into trouble. It opened all sorts of secrets, and there was a real feeling that they were going to be able to travel to the West. That's the big thing they wanted to do. I mean, it's still very difficult. Even in Gorbachev's time, there wasn't the money and there wasn't the freedom. But there was a real intellectual excitement about that. I don't think people outside the big cities really cared very much. What they wanted was food on the table. They wanted a better standard of living, and they weren't getting it. And what people in the factories wanted was more vodka, because Gorbachev had this anti-drink campaign, and it had been dreadfully unpopular. That's one of the things people forget. That's one of the things that brought him down, the fact that he tried to stop people drinking vodka.
That's incredible to think of it like that, isn't it? What was it like in Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union? What were the challenges that Boris Yeltsin faced and the mistakes he made emerging from communism?
Well, Boris had the idea of suddenly trying to make it a functioning capitalist system, I mean, private enterprise. The Russians simply didn't understand that. I mean, what he unleashed was a time of chaos. I mean, a time when those smart people who saw the opportunities, namely the oligarchs, snapped up all the vouchers for the privatization, made themselves immensely rich at the state's cost. It cost them very little. They just bought up the vouchers that were meant to be given to all the employees of various factories and essentially established monopolies, which they exploited ruthlessly. And then there was the worst elements exploited the free market so that pensioners were turned out of their houses by people coming along promising them unlimited vodka if you sign the deal or whatever it might be. I mean, it was as crude as that. But that, of course, led to a period of, frankly, is like an inoculation against democracy. People said, if this is free enterprise, we don't want it. We don't like it. We think it's chaotic. And it did mean a period of real hardship. Living standards collapsed. The people had to sort of sell their goods to make ends meet. Subsidies were basically abolished. Life was pretty tough.
And Peter, how did, when he came to power, Putin end the chaos created by his predecessor?
He put a floor under it. Number one, he reasserted the power of the security ministries and merged with organized crime groups to remove a lot of the chaos from the political and the economic system. But I think more important was the deal he struck with those same oligarchs. He said, you stole everything that you've gotten. I'm not going to take it back so long as you pay your taxes for real and never get involved in politics. And that killed any meaningful attempt at reform, but it also ended the chaos and provided a degree of predictability that the Russians hadn't had since Gorbachev.
Do you think, in that light, Michael, that it really was a bit of a fantasy to ever think that the Russia today would transform into a democracy post-communism?
Yes, I'm afraid it was a bit of a fantasy. I mean, it was a well-meaning fantasy, and it was one that Gorbachev sincerely believed. I mean, he was influenced by what he thought was sort of Swedish social democracy. But, these are very, very different countries. Sweden is a very rich country that's been gradually evolving, or had been, into a really meaningful sort of left-wing social democracy. To transform Russia with its sclerotic economy and authoritarian kind of government and lack of any civic institutions that gave people an input themselves, to transform that into a sort of effective social democracy was almost impossible. I mean, he called it perestroika, rebuilding. But rebuilding, you really have to start from scratch. And what he found is not only do you have to start from scratch, you actually have to knock down the entire edifice as it then was, because it couldn't be adapted.
And Peter, when Putin began to lose touch with people, his reaction was to clamp down at home, embarking on Russian adventurism overseas, Georgia, Syria, annexation of Crimea. Was there a grand plan, do you think, underscoring these?
Oh, yes. Oh, there's totally a grand plan. The Russian space is largely indefensible unless you can establish a forward defense that prevents folks from accessing the Russian heartlands. That means grabbing the Baltic coast and the Polish Gap and the Bessarabian Gap at the Danube Delta and both sides of the Caucasus chain. There have been 9 post-Soviet conflicts to this point, almost all of them instigated by the Kremlin. This predates Putin. Ukraine is just the 9th, the most recent, and it will not be the last.
Ukraine just the 9th. It's quite a thought, isn't it, Michael?
Yes.
He frames that war in Ukraine as part of this existential struggle against the West. Is this feeling new? It doesn't sound like it is from what Peter is saying.
No, the feeling's not new. And the feeling does draw on quite deep-seated Russian national feeling about what their country is and what is the future for the Slavs. I mean, the Russians feel very close to Ukraine. I mean, it's a little bit comparable to England and Scotland. I mean, they are very different, but they've been linked together for 300 years or so. And Ukraine has been part of the Russian Empire and a very vital part, the breadbasket of the Soviet Union as it then was. Not that it produced enough bread, but it attempted to be. And the Russians intermarried with Ukrainians in very large numbers. I mean, there are many, many divided families now, many families where there's a Russian, grandmother or Ukrainian grandmother. They are very close. And therefore, it's all the more painful that they've had this bitter, bitter conflict. But also, Ukraine has fairly bitter memories of Russia itself, of Russian domination, and particularly the one that most people don't remember in the West was the Great Starvation, the Great Hunger in the 1930s, where the collectivization meant that they simply took all the food from the peasants they accused of hoarding it and let people starve, which was a most catastrophic thing to do. And then the Second World War, Ukraine also suffered tremendously, which actually resulted in quite a number of Ukrainians helping the Nazis, feeling that they wanted to throw off the Russians. That they paid dearly for after the war.
And it's still being used today as the mantra
it's still being
by
used
Putin
as an excuse, exactly. So there's a history both of closeness and of antagonism.
Peter, you largely or partially predicted the war in Ukraine in 2021 in an article that you wrote and discussed some of the existential challenges post-Soviet Russia faces as a nation. Has your assessment changed?
No, I'm afraid it hasn't. This is something that we've known has been coming for at least a decade. Russian demographics tell us that the Russian ethnicity is literally dying out. And this is definitely the last century that we will have a Russia in any form. But if they are going to attempt to reestablish that outer crustal defense, they have to do it before they run out of men in their 20s and 30s. So it always had to happen about now. And here we are.
Russia, what is the extent, in your view, what is the threat, the existential threat facing Russia, as you say, it will cease to exist? What do you mean by that?
The demographic issue is definitely terminal. Their birth rate collapsed back in the 1980s and has never recovered. They've had a death rate that's been higher for their birth rate for about 30 years now, and the population under 20 is minuscule, and the population in their 20s for men is only 8 million. So if they're going to use military tactics in an attempt to build a more defensive perimeter, it has to be now. If they wait 10 years, they won't have the people to try.
How do you see that?
Oh, I agree entirely. I mean, it was even a problem in Soviet times. And in fact, there were some very sharp American analysts, I remember, who used to come over and look at the population and look at the collapse and look at, it's particularly a collapse of the male population because they were all ruined by alcohol.
Yeah, I was going to say, back to the vodka again.
It's back to the vodka. I mean, men, the difference in death rates or age of death between men and women was the greatest in the world. Men were dying at the age of sort of 59 or so, something like that, on average. Industrial accidents, alcohol, all sorts of reasons. And the fact, as Peter says, people simply weren't having children, partly because of the difficulties, the feeling that it was too exhausting, there wasn't the money, all sorts of reasons. But that means, as we've heard, there's a very low birth rate now, and sacrificing people for the war in Ukraine is extremely costly. It really is. I mean, the Russians think that they can just throw generations or younger generation into the front line. It costs, and particularly when the brightest and the best are trying to avoid the draft by fleeing, that adds even more to the problem.
Peter, many Eastern European states face the same demographic problems and turmoil after the collapse of the Soviet Union, but they haven't turned to invasion. Is Putin's Russia the outlier here, and why is it the outlier?
Well, Putin's the outlier because Russia could theoretically at least solve some of their problems by achieving domination over the near abroad again. If they can plug those geographic access points, then management of their demographic decline is a purely internal issue. And when it comes to managing restive populations, the Russians are among the best in the world at that. So if they pull this off, they will probably not die out until the 2070s to 2080s. If they fail, we're looking at a disintegration of the Russian system within 20 years. Very different timescale from their point of view.
Yes, I agree. And of course, there are pressures on all sides. I mean, Russia has long been quite worried about the security of Siberia. Huge area, hardly any people, just across the border, an enormous nation, China, with lots of people, capable, rich, looking for some of the land in Siberia, or potentially looking. That's been a long-standing fear of Russia. Therefore, they are quite sort of worried about the security of their territory. And then it goes all the way back. I mean, Russian nationalist myths take us right back to the sort of 15th and 16th century, domination by Poland or Lithuania or these other places that kept sweeping into the west of Russia. And of course, Napoleon, Hitler, all that. The threat came from the west, as they always saw it. And they have experienced that. And so there is a certain nationalist paranoia, which informs Russian politics.
And Peter, Putin now seems to emerge from what seems to have been a relative period of physical isolation. We've seen him travelling for the first time recently to countries that won't hand him over to the International Criminal Court, like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and his confidence at his first end-of-year press conference since the full-scale invasion was evident. He's looking like he feels invincible.
Yeah, a lot of that is going to be a show because he does the big press conference every year in order to make himself seem like a bit of a man of the people, an old-style czar. But a lot of it is just flat-out miscalculation. One of the fun things about the Russian leadership these days is the entire political class, leadership class, is all a descendant of that old KGB coup in 1982. And there's only about 125 of them left. So if you are at the top of that very thin layer of leadership and you don't project confidence, you're done. So he does what he has to do.
Yeah, and he takes apparently difficult questions. He takes people, he allows people to voice what might seem fairly provocative. What are you doing for the country? What about pensions? My part of the country, we can't get any medicines or that sort of thing. And he says, I will look after that. Don't worry, I'm taking care of that. So he will deliberately allow people to put something that appears to be a challenge, but everybody knows, well, Uncle Vlad will look after us. We're going to be all right because it's on his mind. We're not the only ones complaining. He too thinks that there's a thing, he needs to boot people about a bit to get them going. And he appears to make it look as though he is there involved doing things. As Peter said, it's a bit of a show. It really is.
How long do you give him?
Well, I give him, there's no easy way of getting rid of him. It might be that if things really go wrong, he will be, quote, promoted. That's the way they would get rid of him. He would be put as president of the Security Council, sort of overarching body. He will give up the day-to-day job as president, as it were. And they will say that, he is now steering the country's longer-term vision. But in fact, he's been kicked upstairs and then possibly retired on health grounds or something like that. But I don't see that happening immediately. He saw off the Prigozhin threat quite neatly. That was a pretty good warning to all others thinking of the same thing. You might go in a plane that falls out of the sky one day. Be careful.
Peter, can I put the same question to you?
He'll probably be there until the very end. He is definitely of the last generation of KGB officers that are going to run the country. And remember, there's only 125 of them. They're all in their 60s now. There's a small group of people that they've kind of brought in as interns, people like Dmitry Medvedev, who are breathtakingly incompetent, but useful idiots for providing faces to test out messages. But there's no one under age 59 in this system any longer who is capable of taking control. So when they're gone, it's over.
Of course, that was exactly the same in Brezhnev's time. The Politburo was getting older and older and older. They brought in this young revolution. Well, apparently, they didn't think he was a revolutionary, Gorbachev, who was just biding his time. And when he came in, he began to change things a bit. But, for years, we had these sclerotic people in their 70s and 80s who just repeated the same things day in, day out and, lost more and more control to the machine. And the machine just needed to keep going with the same old faces at the top because it was in their interests to keep things ticking along as they'd known it.
So, assuming he's there till the end, what comes next?
Disintegration.
Peter, I'm not
Yeah, hand it over to Peter for that.
Yeah, if you turn back to the origin of Russia after the Mongols retreated, you had an environment of 30 to 40 different duchies who basically were duking it out in a Orwellian free-for-all. We'll probably have some version of that. Right now, if you believe the Russian statistics, which maybe 70 to 75% of the population is ethnically Russian, but it's wildly unproductive, it's wildly unhealthy, and it's aging massively. On the other side, you've got Tatars and Chechens and Bashkirs, who are young, vital populations who are geographically concentrated in places that are very sensitive, like controlling the infrastructure between European Russia and all of Siberia. It doesn't take much imagination to see us going back to that kind of strategic free-for-all where the entity of the Russian Federation just doesn't exist and you get a shattering.
Yes, I don't I don't see actually the Russian Federation collapsing into rival states. I mean, that really would be, what they would call a time of troubles. I mean, that really would be going back to the sort of 15th, 16th century. But yes, certainly, a factional struggle, certainly. There are a lot of smart young Russians growing up. At the moment, they're completely isolated from the political establishment. There are young people in universities. There's some very fine scientists. There's some fine people. They're frustrated. They can't get ahead. If you ask young people, an awful lot of young people talk about, well, this is before the Ukraine war, before Russia was basically shut out of the world structure. A lot of people were talking about emigrating. They wanted to go and live in Western Europe or live in Australia or all sorts of places like that when it might have been possible to do so. Now I think it certainly is. That's an option that's not open. But it meant that there are a lot of people with ambition who are pretty plugged into the world. I mean, the younger generation, they are very switched on social media and all that. They know what's happening elsewhere, and they do have ideas about what they would like to see. Whether they have the levers of power to achieve any of that is unclear.
We spoke earlier, Michael, about the way the West reacted after the fall of the Soviet Union, how it didn't provide the kind of support and respect perhaps that was being craved. I'm just wondering what the correct posture should be towards President Putin and his Russia right now.
Well, it should be one of don't think you can get away by bullying. You're on a present course which is frankly never going to achieve what you want, namely security for your country. Your nationalist dream is incompatible with a modern world. You cannot have this idea that you just reconquer what your old space used to be, however much they feel that they would like to do so strategically. But there is a strong element of nationalism, Russian nationalism, which is the sort of bedrock, which, interestingly, they've drawn on again in the same way that they drew on it in 1941. It is our mother Russia up against the world. And they are drawing on that. And that is why even younger people, you're not seeing a groundswell of hatred against the regime or internal collapse. Partly, of course, it's very repressive now. It really is dangerous to voice opposition. But there is a fundamentalist nationalist agenda, which I have to say is really promoted by the church as the repository of Russian national feeling. It always has been. So that is there. I don't see where it will go, and I don't see how the West can usefully do anything except just hold firm and say, this is how we live, you're not going to disrupt it.
Peter, our mother Russia against the world. Can you see a world at all where Putin can be the leader of a non-expansionist Russia?
No, and I don't see the environment being favorable for a non-expansionist Russia until we actually have the break. I think the best example I can give you is the Prigozhin-Wagner rebellion. They drove 1,500 kilometers to Moscow. Not one Russian officer defected to join the rebellion, but not one Russian officer stood against Wagner. There's no love for the regime. There's no love for the government whatsoever. People are going through the paces. There's no passion there to create something different.
That's absolutely true. I mean, that was the greatest challenge of all to Putin when he realized that the Wagner group, Prigozhin, was welcomed with rejoicing in Rostov, the first town they sort of established themselves in, and before they started driving up towards Moscow. And when he realized, that the people were sort of cheering and waving, that must have been a real shock, But it exposed the fact that there was no love for the government at all.
If we could just end with a final thought from both of you. I just wonder if you could sort of put this into context. We're talking about the collapse of the Soviet Union. If we're looking ahead to the next year, or perhaps if you want to put a longer time frame on it, what do you predict in terms?
Well, I predict something that everybody says I shouldn't say because it's defeatist and it's not right. But I predict that the Ukraine war will come to a stalemate. I think it's almost coming to that now. I predict that Russia cannot really continue the frontline full-scale onslaught anymore, and I predict the Ukrainians can't afford it either. They're not getting the money, they're not getting the weapons, not in sufficient quantities. I predict that China will come along and say, look, you need to end it. You need to declare victory where you are and essentially just stop the fighting where it is now. There will be no peace deal. Neither side trusts each other an inch. The West would not recognize anything like that, but I predict that the fighting may probably simply stop. And then after that, it's absolutely unclear what the Russians would do.
Peter?
The Russians aren't going to stop because they can't. If the war were to freeze in its current line, they're actually in a significantly worse position, not just diplomatically, but strategically than they were before. They're far more exposed. And if they can't make it to Warsaw and the Danube, they will disintegrate over the next 15 years. So I don't think it matters what the economic pressure is or the diplomatic pressure is from anywhere. If they lose the war this year, they're just going to try again as soon as they feel they are able, as long as they are able. What I would like to see in the West is something we failed to do the first time around. We couldn't imagine what it would look like on the next day if Russia fell, if the Soviets fell. And we're still cleaning up that mess. This is part of cleaning up that mess. We need to prepare for a world where Moscow power breaks. And arguably we need to do the same thing for Beijing, because I think Beijing's going to break first, but that's a topic for another day.
And I look forward to talking to you both about that sometime.
Yes, yeah. I can see a disagreement coming here. But
we'll keep that one in our back pocket
yes.
then. Peter Zeihan, Michael Binyon, great to speak to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
This was a pleasure.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. My thanks to you for watching. You can support us by subscribing now, or listen to Times Radio, or go to thetimes.co.uk. My thanks to our producer, Louis Sykes, and to you for watching. Bye-bye.